My next guest, my next guest is Jessica Lahey. Jessica is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure: How to the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Over 20 years, Jess has taught every grade from 6 to 12 in both public and private schools and spent 5 years teaching in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents in Vermont. She writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for the Washington Post, New York Times, and The Atlantic, and is a book critic for Airmail, and has also written educational curriculum for Amazon Kids award-winning The Stinky and the Dirty Show. She co-hosts the hashtag #MWriting podcast with best-selling authors KJ Del Antonio and Serena Bowen from her house in Vermont, where she lives with her husband, 2 sons, and a lot of dogs. Welcome to the podcast, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, thanks so much for being on. And I heard about your book on a webinar that I attended recently, and I really wanted to learn more about your book and learn about your story as well. So we'll start out with my first question. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to call out.
So a lot happened to me in 2013. First of all, I sold my first book, The Gift of Failure, and it was a big deal for me. I mean, it was a big deal because it was a big auction. We had like 14 different editors bidding for it. It was a big deal. And that was at the beginning of the year. And then right after I sold it, I had to get sober because I'd been needing to get sober for a while, but my dad intervened on me and prompted that to happen. And then right after I got sober, I started writing Gift of Failure. And at the end of the year, I handed it in on time. I don't know how I wrote it that fast. Well, I do know how I wrote it that fast because it was the day after I handed it in. I was all relieved and everything. And then the day after I handed it in, I was taking a nice horseback ride with my husband, who never goes horseback riding with me. And that horse threw me and I landed on my head and I lost my memory. And for a while there, lost the ability to read and look at a computer screen and do a lot of things that I spend basically my life doing, including I couldn't write my column for the New York Times. And then right after that, I got the notes on The Gift of Failure. And that was essentially that version of the book was unpublishable. It was not very good. And all of that stuff together, including the post-concussion syndrome, led to just a really deep hole. I mean, you talk about a trench. This was like a deep hole. And thank goodness I had already stopped drinking because it probably could have gotten pretty ugly if I hadn't. So, post-concussion syndrome can equal, this bad depression and confusion and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's pretty much the deepest hole I've ever been in. And I credit, number one, being patient with my brain. Number two, having a really supportive a spouse. In fact, I dictated some of my columns to him and he typed them and edited them because I just couldn't write them. And an editor who was incredibly generous and supportive and kind and let me have 2 chapters at a time probation to sort of like get this book in order without hiring a ghostwriter to help me. And I ended up being able to write the book by myself. I ended up getting better. It took many months from the concussion, but it was a lot of things that if they'd happened in a different order, if I was still drinking, I might be not here with us today. So I really am proud of sort of how my army sort of showed up for me during that and how I showed up for myself during that. So yeah, that was pretty deep.
And that was, that fall was less than a year after that you become sober, correct?
That was 6 months after I'd gotten sober. Yeah, less than 6 months because I got sober on June 7th, 2013, and I bunked my head on November 1st, 2013.
Wow. Yeah. So it was perfect timing for your dad's intervention and for you to realize, you really need to stop.
Yeah.
So, and, readers can read more about that in your book. We're going to talk about the new release, The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. So I wanted to first ask, at what age do you think parents should start talking to their kids about the dangers of substance abuse?
Well, I can tell you when most start doing it, if they do it at all, and that's usually around middle school or maybe a little after middle school, like when they are about to go into high school. And that is way too late, mainly because middle school is when kids are going to start experimenting if they're going to start experimenting. So In the book, honestly, nursery school and pre and kindergarten. And the reason I say that is not because I expect you to start talking to your kids in nursery school about methamphetamine use, but because that's when we start to talk about the things that really, so backing up for a second, there are really, really good substance use prevention programs out there. Most of the time we're not using them. Only 57% of schools, for example, have any substance use prevention program. And of that 57%, only 10% are evidence-based. But we do have ways, and we do have an organization, one's called Blueprints out of University of Colorado Boulder, that assesses these programs independently to make sure they actually work and are based on evidence. And what we know about those programs is that they're really good quality at their heart. They're really good quality social emotional learning programs with a health component, and they start really young. So when kids are really young, preschool, kindergarten, we're talking about things like, why do we spit out the toothpaste instead of swallowing it? Why do we not take those brightly colored pills that, look like candy? Why do we not eat Tide Pods? Taking it further, why can you find the letters of mommy's name on this prescription bottle sitting here on the bathroom counter? And why do you think, like, even if you had the same infection that mommy has, why do you think you can't take mommy's medicine? Those kind of conversations start very early. And I will tell you right now, the more often we have these conversations about health and safety and developmentally appropriate conversations about drugs and alcohol as well, the more we have them, the easier they are to have. So starting early is really, really important. Just like starting early with, your body and what we might think of as a sex conversation, but isn't really about a sex conversation. It's about bodily autonomy and, making sure we know what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with when it comes to our bodies.
Yeah. And I was surprised to hear when you pointed out the 57% of schools, they're only that few use the programs, but that really needs to
and that's any programs at all. And some of the programs that are out there, at least historically anyway, so a lot have been updated lately. But, for example, back, DARE started back in the 80s, and early on that program was actually, the kids who came out of that program were more likely to use drugs and alcohol, not less. So, knowing what's happening in our schools is really, really important. And social emotional learning programs are all the rage right now. So if we know that good social emotional learning programs are especially important to kids right now coming out of this pandemic, why not use one that is proven and that has a great health component for drugs and alcohol?
Well, us both being a product of the 80s, we remember that this is your brain on drugs, right? So, you say in the book that the Just Say No campaign, and a lot of, I've heard at other places as well, that, that really didn't work. And we should say no to that.
Scared straight programs don't work either. And I put the egg one under the humor version of Scared Straight. I remember it was funny, but it was really attempting to scare you into thinking you were frying your brain. And, aside from the fact that it was a really bad analogy, the Scared Straight stuff doesn't work either. Having someone come in and say, here are all the horrible things that happened to me because I use drugs and alcohol, those don't work.
Well, tell me about why information is power, because in your book, you talk a lot about the brain development of kids, and more, I think in the past 5 years, educators are learning about, the hippocampus and, how the brain doesn't stop developing until kids are 25. So just why should parents and educators and anybody who's working with kids a lot know more about the brain and just emotional reaction and that impulsivity that kids have?
There's so many reasons for not only anyone working with kids, but kids themselves to understand how their brains work. Going back to gift of failure stuff, I was walking around in a school at the Momentous Institute in Dallas, Texas. And they, one of the things they do from kindergarten on is talk to kids about their lower brain functions, like the amygdala, and they actually teach them words like that, and the upper brain functions, like, thinking before you speak, and that kind of, executive function stuff that doesn't tend to come online until later. Because when you give kids the information that it's okay that you want to punch Johnny next to you for saying something mean, but that's your lower brain talking. And we want to try to engage that higher brain. How else do you think that you could respond to Johnny from your upper brain? And that kind of stuff helps kids feel empowered. It helps kids feel like they have a sense of self-efficacy, and even giving them the information that, when they screw up in middle school, especially because that's the fun of teaching middle school, is they screw up all the time. And I love teaching middle school for that reason, because it's just wonderful and fun to watch these pupa people walking around. That some of that is not their fault either, that we specifically give them more than they can handle in middle school. So understanding from their standpoint, helping them understand how their brains work and how they can start to learn how to tap into the stuff that they're growing into, that executive function, frontal lobe stuff, is really empowering. And it helps them feel less helpless when framed the right way. But anyone who works with kids, I think, not just because it helps you have patience about why kids act the way they do. I mean, it also helps you bust some of the myths about the things that we tend to believe about kids. When kids, everything from understanding that they have what's called a sleep phase delay. And so when we're bugging them to go to sleep at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and they say they're not tired, and we really think they're lying, they're not lying. They have sleep phase delay. It's their melatonin doesn't kick in until later than it does for adults. Or when they claim they're not sleepy, but you can tell that they are. Well, kids can't tell as well as we can when they're tired and when they're not. They also are less able to detect the signs that they've been drinking too much. So for, bringing back around to addiction inoculation, there are lots of things that happen in the teen brain when they're using drugs and drinking that are different from the adult brain. And to make this really clear, all of the stuff I talk about in this book is about the adolescent brain. When adults want to make decisions about using drugs and alcohol, that's a completely different topic than adolescents. There are drugs and alcohol out there. There's substances out there that are, low to moderate risk for adult brains that are moderate to high risk in an adolescent brain. So helping parents understand other things like that the adolescent brain is doing exactly what it is supposed to be doing when it's seeking out novelty, and especially novelty that comes with a little bit of risk inherently, because that's what adolescence is supposed to do. It's supposed to prepare people for adulthood. And the only way to do that is to push them out of their comfort zone and make them want to do things that are a little challenging to them. And so it's our role as adults, as parents, as mentors, as teachers, to direct that craving for novelty in a direction toward positive risk and constructive positive risk. And I think understanding things like, when we say, oh my gosh, these stupid teenagers, they don't know the consequences of their actions. Well, that's just not true. It's just that the adolescent brain weighs the potential benefits of an action more heavily than it weighs the potential risks of an action. So it's our job to help be kind of like a training wheel, I suppose, that, that I don't know if you've ever looked at them carefully, but, training wheels don't just stay really close to the ground. They have these nuts that you can loosen, and they lift them up away from the ground so that the bike can teeter and totter just a little bit further toward the ground. So what we want to do is make it so they can wobble a little. And then as they get older, we raise those training wheels higher and higher and higher. So the wobble gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And our comfort with that wobble and their comfort with that wobble gets bigger and bigger. So that by the time it's time for them to go off and get a job or leave home or go to college, whatever those things are, an hour capacity to handle the wobbles has increased so much that they just don't need to be caught by us anymore, that they can be caught by themselves. And part of understanding that comes from understanding how the adolescent brain works. And my last point about this is that one of the things we have to really have a good hold on is that drugs and alcohol do a lot more damage to the adolescent brain, mainly because the adolescent brain is in the second of two major restructuring, overhaul, reconnecting, connecting, and then later pruning processes, only rivaled by ages 0 to 2. And just as we wouldn't give a 0 to 2-year-old alcohol because it would mess with their brain, and we always say, there's no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy, At least the WHO does, the World Health Organization. Same is true for an adolescent brain. And, the saying that goes around and around in my head over and over again with adolescents and alcohol and drugs is delay, 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 not just because I'm worried about keeping their brains intact until they're done developing, not just intact, but helping their brains develop the way they're supposed to until it's done in the early to mid 20s. But because the older they are when they have their first taste or hit or whatever, the more we protect them from their lifelong risk of substance use disorder, the more it goes down. So an 8th grader who tries drugs and alcohol has somewhere around a 50% lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder, whereas an 18-year-old has about a 10% risk of developing substance use disorder. And that's a huge deal. Yes, there is an issue of causation and correlation there, and there's a lot of statistical confounders we could talk about, but the reality is that when I tell my 17-year-old, no, not until it is legal for you, which frankly, I don't care about the law. What I care about is the brain development. What I'm saying to him is, I know for a fact that the longer I can prevent you from taking drugs and alcohol, the more I can protect your brain and the lower I can make your risk for substance use disorder. And given that my kids have my genetics, and I am an alcoholic with almost 8 years of recovery. It'll be 8 years in 2 weeks. I'm so excited. My kids, genetics is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. And if I wasn't doing everything I could to otherwise lower their lifelong risk, I would be I would not be doing my job as a parent. So helping them understand that that's why I'm doing it also is important to get across to kids. They're not big fans of the because I said so, but they're big fans of the why and the let me explain to you why I'm doing what I'm doing.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some students that you've worked with in the past about kind of their story of struggles and maybe the age range of students and how you've just assisted them in your work in the rehab facility.
Yeah. So to be clear, when I started working in the drug and alcohol rehab, where I was a teacher for 5 years, it clearly was not the first time I'd worked with kids struggling with substance use disorder. I tell the story of Georgia in my book towards the end of the book. And Georgia, by the time I met her, she started drinking in middle school. She started drinking, interestingly, because her school in middle school was trying to do an anti-drug, drug and alcohol prevention program. So they had some guy from the local 12-step meeting come in and explain just how ugly and horrible and out of control his life got before he got into recovery. The problem is that for Georgia, she was really suffering from really terrible anxiety, and it was unbearable for her. And all she wanted was an escape from that. And so when he said at that assembly that drugs and alcohol make you not feel things, Georgia was like, ooh, I am all over that. And that was when she took, later that week was when she took her first drink. And it really worked for her because a lot of drugs and alcohol are they're great medication in the very short term. Alcohol, for example, really exacerbates anxiety terribly. But at the time, she didn't care about that. What she wanted was some relief. And so kids like that come in, would end up in my rehab classroom all the time. I had a couple of different kinds of kids. All of them started using drugs and alcohol either because they were medicating their psychic and emotional pain for some reason, either because of adverse childhood experiences like abuse, neglect, incarceration of a parent, death of a parent, divorce, separation. What else is on that list? All of this is listed, obviously, in the new book. And then some of them were doing it because they felt like they had a really, really low level of self-efficacy in their lives. They didn't feel like they had any control. They felt like no matter what they did, they had no control to change the circumstances of their lives. That's another big risk factor. Many of the students had undiagnosed or very late diagnosed learning disorders. A lot of them had ADD or ADHD, which is another massive risk factor for substance use. Mainly because drugs and alcohol for all of these conditions work great. The receptors for pain, whether emotional or physical, are the same. You can numb out your pain. You can take alcohol to lessen your anxiety. You can smoke weed to make your ADHD more bearable. And so figuring out, the hard part about getting sober is when we take away the substances, suddenly they're left with the feelings.
Yeah.
And recovery for kids, by the way, looks different for recovery than recovery for adults. It's just a very different situation, which is why it's really important, if you're going to send your kids somewhere, to make sure that they have a history working with kids and not just applying the adult methods to children. They're different. But when you see these kids dealing with all of the stuff for the very first time, not only going through withdrawal, but seeing them dealing with all of the psychic pain they've been dealing with, and as their writing teacher, often they were writing about it, it was a lot, but also by far one of the most rewarding teaching experiences I've had in my entire life.
And were most of the kids successful in maintaining sobriety, or were there relapses?
In order to answer that question, I can tell a whole bunch of stories, but I really would encourage people to go online, whether that's through YouTube TV or MTV Online or whatever, and watch a program called 16 and in Recovery. Okay. The kids on this show, it's 3 or 4 episodes, and it was shot over a period of time at North Shore Recovery Center in Massachusetts. And by the way, this is the sort of school that it's my goal to someday have the opportunity to open a recovery high school. And it's not, I say a recovery high school, it's not a sober high school, because relapse is very much a picture for kids. So it's very rare, actually, for kids to get and stay sober on their first try. Not that it doesn't happen. It absolutely does happen. It's difficult. It's just different for kids, mainly because they don't have a lot of control over their environment, mainly because many of them come from situations that they can't just move away from. And, we said, when we come out of recovery, if most of our friends are using, often we have to make new friends. And for kids, that can be a very difficult thing to do. And then, of course, if we get them sober, we tend to send them back to the exact same environment they were in before they got sober. And yes, I know plenty of kids who've gotten sober and stayed sober. Georgia, who I feature in the book, she has been sober for a long time now. She is doing great. She's in a master's degree program. She's healing relationships that got broken terribly during this, but a lot of other stuff happened that, she was in jail. She lost custody of a child. There's a lot and the other thing is, when you start using drugs and alcohol and you're not dealing with your psychic pain or your emotional pain or your traumas, often your development gets arrested at the age that you started using. So at the rehab, we had the youngest kid we ever treated there was 12 going on 13. So you can imagine what you would be like if you were frozen at 12 at the developmental age. It's a really difficult thing to help them through not just getting sober, but having the emotional resources they need in order to stay sober. And often those emotional resources come from our upper brain. And if they've been avoiding development and some of those connections have been hijacked by drugs and alcohol, often you're dealing with kids who are not just, it's not just that you teach them the way to be and suddenly they understand how to have adult resources. It's that it's never even occurred to them. Their brain has never developed to the point where they have those resources to engage. So it's a very complicated story with children.
No, but what you've shared tells so much just about kind of understanding those struggles that kids have, and how we can support them if we.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important to understand their brains, because if I didn't understand what, for example, trauma-informed teaching was, I would not understand that when a kid acted up in that classroom, the one thing I could not do was send them away and give up on them. The one thing I could not do, well, I guess now I'm saying more than one thing, the 3 things I could not do was give up on them, walk away, or get angry in return, because
Mhm.
that means I will lose them forever. And I've done it. I wrote about it actually in a book called This Is 40, about that I was a part of a couple of years ago. When a girl, what happened was, a girl in the rehab set out to make me angry because
Mhm.
her experience with adults is, I can't trust them, they give up on me. So she set out to test me and make me angry so that it
Mhm.
would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and she could say, see, all adults give up on me. And
Mhm.
I did give up on her. I got angry and I sent her out of the room, and I never got her back, in terms of, she was never on my side. She never trusted me. I was never able to teach her anything. And that was my fault. I did that. And it was because I got angry at the response and didn't think about why she was doing it. And
Mhm.
that's why
Mhm.
trauma-informed teaching is so important for people who work with kids. And that's all of us, by the way, people who work with kids who have gone through trauma, through adverse childhood experiences, who are acting out because that's the best they can do in that moment. If we send them out of class, if we put them in detention, if we suspend them, all we're doing is saying, we don't have time for you. We can't cope with you. And by the way, we're not going to support you from here on out. So, we're further driving them away from a supportive educational environment.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's so important to remember. I wanted to talk a little bit about adults and their habits.
Yeah.
As parents, they're watching us. They're seeing what we do. They're seeing how many glasses of wine their parents might drink per
Mhm.
night, or if their parents smoke weed. Those types of things. So, how can that influence kids to become users, and or if you're the type of parent who's saying, well, these are the dangers of drug and alcohol, yet you're saying, okay, well, I'm over 21 and, I'm a
Right.
legal adult. I'm still,
Mhm.
I can take a glass of wine or two every
Mhm.
evening. So where do you draw that line? Like, when you're trying to set a good example for your kids.
Right. One thing I would love to point out first is that you cannot teach a child moderation. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
so all of those parents who are like, oh, I want to raise my kid like those European children and let them have sips so that they'll
Mhm.
grow
Mhm.
up to be like those moderate European drinkers. Well, first of all, the moderate European myth doesn't exist, mainly because the European Union, historically that was just mostly Eastern Europe, but it's not now. The
Mhm.
European Union has the highest alcohol consumption rate in the world. So the European moderation myth is bull. And we also, especially for the 10% of us like me who are wired differently, teaching moderation doesn't exist for me.
Mhm.
When I have a drink, I want all of the drinks. And so it's not like I can, keep my fingers crossed and let my kids have sips so that they'll become
Mhm.
moderate drinkers. It just doesn't work. And also I want to remind parents that when I say 10%, most of your kids, that whether it's when they're kids or when they're young adults, try drugs and alcohol,
Mhm.
will be fine. They will be probably fine. I mean, as adolescents, yes, it does some damage to the brain. And so hopefully it's when they're adults. But if they're not part of that 10%, then they can probably use some drugs and alcohol and not get addicted. However, all of that said, I am not saying that you cannot use drugs and alcohol in front of your kid. Obviously, I would
Mhm.
prefer that you not use drugs, heavier drugs in front of your kids, because obviously they're illegal and that's a big deal. And, that's sending a very weird message to your kids. But drinking around your kids is not the issue. And in states where it's legal, using pot around your kids is not the issue.
Mhm.
What is
Mhm.
the issue is our messaging around
Mhm.
why we are using drugs and alcohol. And when we tell our kids things like, when we say things like, oh man, I hope there's plenty of wine at grandma's house for
Mhm.
Thanksgiving because, I'm going to need it. Or, this was a really tough day at work. I
Mhm.
need a glass of wine. Or,
Mhm.
anything, any sort of communication that tells them that what we're doing is drinking or using drugs in order to
Mhm.
mute, mask, avoid, not deal with our emotions is
Mhm.
problematic.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that's easy, because for me, the drink that I miss most is the one I could have right before I went to a social event so that I could lessen my social anxiety and
Mhm.
reduce that, the shouting voice of that imposter syndrome in my head. Um, but not being able to drink for 8 years means that I've faced that social anxiety
Yeah.
and faced that imposter syndrome stuff. So I think a lot in dealing with that messaging, I think it's also really important to talk about how alcohol and drugs are marketed to kids, how they're being manipulated by marketers. But most of all, I'm going to say, I think the way we talk about drugs and alcohol is more problematic than the fact that we do drugs and alcohol. And by all means, if you want to drink moderately in front of your kid, if you want to use marijuana moderately in front of your kid, that is your prerogative. But at the same time, I would be really, really careful about the language you use in front of your child, or the why.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you talked a little bit about the marketing. How is that marketed? Is it through the beer commercials? Just the fact that everybody's having a good time with the beer. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. What I'm mostly talking about, when my kids, adolescents in general, do not enjoy being manipulated. It really rubs them the wrong way. And so one of the things you can do is capitalize on that. And one of the choices we made in our house from the time our kids were young is we didn't have broadcast television in the house for a long time, just because I hate ads. I just hate them. Yeah. They just make me mad. So when we would see ads, one of the things we would do is say things like, what do you think they're advertising here? Those ads where you watch them and you're like, I'm not even sure what they're selling here. But often with alcohol ads, what they're selling is camaraderie and closeness and sexiness and a lot of things that have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you drink a particular brand. But one of the things I do talk to my kids about is the incredible value of brand loyalty. Like if they can hook my 17-year-old into a particular brand of beer, people tend to stick with their brands, and cigarettes too, and that kind of thing. And that's worth a lot to companies. And there are certain industries and certain so for example, sports. So one of the things we know about the people who drink the most in college, the people who drink the most in college are athletes and sports. There's a bunch of them. People who are involved in the Greek system, people who are involved with sports in one of two ways, either because they play them. And by the way, the higher the contact of the sport, the more alcohol probably is consumed. The big four are football, wrestling, lacrosse, and hockey. So those four are the big four. But people who are really ardent sports fans also are some of the biggest drinkers, and especially if they're at a big sports school. So just knowing that is really important. And it's worth mentioning when you're watching, the World Cup, why are those alcohol ads so often behind that athlete when they're standing there, right before the game starts? That's not random. That's done very much on purpose. Having those alcohol emblems, ads, merchandising, that stuff is all placed very, very carefully because it is worth millions and millions of dollars, and not just in brand recognition, but in brand loyalty. So having those conversations with kids, I think, is really, really important so that they understand how someone is out to actively manipulate them, so that you can use their orneriness and contrariness, their natural contrariness, for their benefit.
That's really interesting to notice. I wanted to talk about the fact that not my kid isn't a thing. Like people from any demographic area or family structure, they can become alcoholics.
Unfortunately, historically, the way that addiction, the way that we're supposed to be calling it substance use disorder, by the way, the way we talk about substance use disorder has been very much influenced by racism, by and so, for example, back in the 80s when the newscasters were saying that, crack has broken the gateway hypothesis and it's so addictive, you can use it once and blah, blah, blah. And they had all these images of the Black urban man on crack who's has superhuman strength. And even if you shoot him, he'll come back at you, which they used during the George Floyd trial, by the way. They tried to imply that because he had fentanyl in his system, that he was the superhuman Black man who, couldn't be stopped. So, and there was, it tends to come up in the news that way. But you'll notice that there wasn't a huge brouhaha in the media about heroin when heroin was killing thousands and thousands of people. But suddenly when rich white kids started getting hooked on prescription opiates, it became a crisis. Suddenly it's a crisis. And it's been a crisis. Drugs killing off people has been a crisis for a very long time. And it's really unfortunate that we, the media, and I'm putting myself in the we, tend to only start to notice when it starts to kill off rich white kids. So I think it's really important to remember that the way we talk about drugs and alcohol tends to be from a not my kid kind of perspective. But as Stephen King, who is a recovering alcoholic, by the way, likes to say, we all look about the same when we're vomiting in the gutter. And it's absolutely true. If you look at if you look at the demographics for drug and alcohol use, there are some differences across racial and ethnic lines in terms of what gets used and at what age and in what succession and all that kind of stuff. But no, based on who's come through my doors at my rehab classroom, we are in absolutely no position to say not my kid, especially since one of the funniest things that used to happen is I would go, because the kids in my rehab classroom were constantly turning over based on who was coming in and who was leaving, who was finishing up. I had to reintroduce myself every week for the newcomers. And I would say, hi, I'm Jess. I'm an alcoholic. And more often than not, someone would say, you don't look like an alcoholic. And the reason I don't look like an alcoholic is that I'm, younger. Often people tend to think of the, 12-step programs as like these old gray-haired men who sit there and drink coffee. And I can tell you, after having spent 8 years in the rooms, it is not. There are lots and lots of people like me. There are lots of people who are, perfectionists and do really well in school and do great in college and lose, their ability to control their drinking over time. There are lots of people who start out on prescription opiates because of a car accident or because they tried one that their friend gave them that came from the medicine cabinet and ended up, using heroin and homeless. And so I think getting at, I quote in the book, Chris Herron, who was a Boston Celtic, talk about, what addicts look like. Chris Herron was one of the Boston Celtics. And there's a story he tells about the fact that one time he was about to play, he was in his warm-ups for a Celtics game, and his dealer wasn't getting to the Boston Garden, the old Boston Garden, fast enough. And so Chris had to go outside in his Celtics warm-ups and wait on the sidewalk for his dealer to get there so that he could take opiates because he was in withdrawal. And Chris says over and over again, and if you get a chance to watch his documentary called hold on, I'll come up with it just in 1 second. Because one of the things he says is we worry so much about the last time people take drugs and alcohol. We tend to tell the war stories about that last hurrah. We tend to not think very much about the first time. And the first time is all, from my perspective with kids especially, is, and for this is what Chris, this is not, me, this is obviously also Chris talking about the fact that, what is it about a kid that when they go to a party in their friend's house's, the basement of their friend's house, that they feel like they're not enough in that moment. They're like me, feeling socially anxious going to a party, or they're like Brian, who I tell the story of in the book, who just wants to be accepted and loved. And the only people that he finds he can find that from are the people who are using drugs and alcohol around him. How is it that we can help kids feel like they are enough so that they don't feel the need to go use in order to feel enough? How is it that we can help them deal with their emotions, their overwhelming emotions and their pain and their trauma, so that they don't feel like they need to go use drugs and alcohol to mask or mute or numb that pain? It's our job as adults to help kids, whether that's with an early intervention for academic failure, an early intervention for aggression, an early intervention for a learning difference, an early intervention for, whatever that thing is that kids are needing help with, because that makes them feel other or not enough. That's our job, is to make sure kids get that help, or at least that we're able to talk to someone who can help us get them that help. And that's why I spend so much so many words in the book talking about how to find the allies who can help you get help for your kid, even if you need free or sliding scale treatment, not just treatment for drugs and alcohol, but treatment for learning issues and emotional issues and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's so important to point out, where people can get those resources and, help either their own kids or kids that they're working with, kids they're interacting with in sports or clubs, that might not be in a school. Well, I've had such a great conversation with you today, and I've learned so much. Out of everything we talked about, what's one thing that you'd like listeners to remember?
Oh, just the delay that with each passing year,
Mhm.
each passing month, our kids get. I mean, if you think about the number of synapses there's this process called synaptogenesis, and
Mhm.
trillions of synapses are being created, all the time. And so if we can just every day, every month, every year that we can get kids closer to that, early 20s, mid
Mhm.
20s,
Mhm.
when their brain is finished developing, we not only lower their lifelong risk of substance use disorder, but we preserve the ability for their brain to keep developing in a healthy manner so that whatever capacity they have as thinkers, as innovators, as creatives, as human beings just interacting with other human beings in some sort of emotionally intelligent way, any capacity their brain may have, the longer they're not using drugs and alcohol, the more potential they will have. So delay.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so important to remember. And, with all the research that you've done and put into the book and reasons why, I totally get, I might not have thought about that when I was growing up and, started, experimenting with alcohol earlier than my early 20s. But, I think just realizing about the brain development and so much that we've learned in the past couple of years about that.
Well,
Well,
and
where,
I think just so you know, I think
Mhm.
also, someone's going to hear you say that and say, well, just because you tell your kid about their brain development
Yeah.
doesn't mean that they're going to stop. But if you
Mhm.
know your kid really well, and that's the other big message in here
Yeah.
is the more we know kids for who they are and value what they're interested in and value their goals and value
Mhm.
the things that
Mhm.
they want,
Mhm.
the more we understand that, the more we can use their own goals as leverage. So if
Mhm.
I know that my kid really wants to produce music, let's say and one of the big answers I often got in my rehab classroom was, I want to be a rapper. Okay, well, you want to
Yeah.
be a rapper? Cool. Let's talk about all the intermediate goals, all the goals you need to achieve in order to do that. One of them obviously is stay sober, but for a kid
Mhm.
who's not
Mhm.
using, you know, there are so many skills involved in doing that. Memory, oh my gosh, memory is and the ability to think, to be an agile thinker. People who are really talented at rapping have the ability to string ideas and free
Mhm.
associate
Mhm.
ideas and words together. And you cannot do that when you interrupt the flow of words and ideas in your brain through substances. It's just, the reason that people that we have this caricature of, like Cheech and Chong not being able to remember what they said 2 minutes ago is because, when we smoke pot, what we're doing, weed messes with the hippocampus, because the receptors for the active ingredients in marijuana are right there in the hippocampus. And so that's why it messes with our short-term memory. If you want to make it so that you suddenly can't rap because you can't string a lot of ideas together in a consistent manner in a recording studio, smoke a lot of weed. But if you would
Mhm.
like to be successful, and all apologies to Snoop Dogg, but if you would like to be successful, smoking a lot of weed is not going to be your best idea, simply because it's going to hamper you, especially as you're learning how to do this thing that you are so desperate to do. It's going to hamper your ability to do that. So use
Mhm.
their own goals as a way of communicating the risks involved. And I think we'll at least get closer to helping them weigh risks in a way that makes sense.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's meeting them where they're at.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Well, where can people find you online and connect with you?
Everything, including I do a lot of speaking. So my speaking schedule, increasingly, a lot of these virtual events are being open to the public. So you
Mhm.
can hear me
Mhm.
speak, that my speaking schedule's there. On my website, you can also find out where to get signed copy of my books, because there's some wonderful local booksellers here in Vermont that are shipping out signed and personalized copies. So everything is at Jessica Lahey, LAHE.com, jessicalahey.com.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being a
You're
guest
so
on the Out of the
welcome.
Trenches podcast. It was great talking with you today.
So great talking to you too. Thank you so much.